and Sarah Norris, and today we have a very special guest. This is Lindsay Beckerman. She's an occupational therapist that we work with here at STAR, and she's a feeding therapist. And so we're going to talk to Lindsay today about a really big topic, and that's how sensory can impact feeding.
Yeah, so I think starting out, can you just kind of give us an overview of how sensory relates to feeding?
It's a great question. So we know that feeding or eating is actually the hardest thing that we do. And the primary reason why it's so hard is because it takes the simultaneous integration of all of our sensory systems at the same time. And our body has to keep readjusting every time we chew. So that's a lot of sensory information to be processing.
So you're talking about there's visual components to eating, and there's tactile components or touch for eating. There's movement.
So every time we chew, actually our head shifts off midline slightly, and so there is a vestibular component. And especially if you think about drinking out of a cup, especially an open cup when we have to tip our head back, that definitely involves a bigger vestibular piece.
What about auditory?
So again, chewing in your head can sometimes be really loud. Think about what it sounds like when you eat something squishy or soft versus something crunchy and dry.
Yeah, and I think one that I've learned about a lot working next to you guys is how praxis and posture, those movement-based disorders that we talked about a couple weeks ago, how those can impact feeding too.
Absolutely. Our bodies has a higher priority for not falling on your head. So our second priority is that postural piece. So if you're worried about falling out of your chair, our third priority is eating. So eating's not important if you're unstable from a postural standpoint.
That's a really good point. What about praxis?
So praxis is huge because what a lot of people don't realize is how many motor movements are involved with every chew. It's one of, eating involves all of our cranial nerves. It involves so many muscles, moving our tongue, crossing midline, getting the food up to your mouth. All of those pieces have a huge praxis component that can make eating really tricky.
And the one that I'm thinking about right now, because we talked about it recently, is interoception. So how does that impact eating?
Yeah, so, if my stomach hurts, how do I know if my stomach hurts because I'm hungry or because I need to go to the bathroom or because I'm full? And so being able to read your body's cues to help you identify when you're hungry and what to eat and how much to eat is really important too.
Yeah, I found that working in the adult population, even if they didn't have significant enough challenges to get therapy earlier in life, almost all my adults have some component of feeding concerns, whether it's I don't know how often to eat, so I eat at specific times every day. I have a hard time making meals. I am sensitive to touch, so I have a very limited amount of foods that I tolerate. And I think thinking about it throughout the lifespan, I know that there's a lot online about pediatric feeding programs and pediatric therapies, but thinking about the adolescent and adult population, I don't know, have you worked in that population much?
Yeah, I've seen a ton of adults and teens lately, and it's hard because parents want to think that their kid will grow out of it. And when it's a physical skill-based problem, they don't grow out of it just because they go to kindergarten and all the other kids are eating and so they want to eat too. Or they don't turn 5 or 6 and decide that they don't need bottles anymore because now they're big kids. When it's a skill problem, it doesn't go away unless we work on those skill deficits.
So talking about the skill deficits that you can have, I'm thinking of the different profiles that you can have with your sensory systems, and that's going to create different challenges and different skill deficits, right?
Absolutely.
So kind of thinking about the over-responsive person who's primarily just everything's too much, that's going to be different than someone who's, say, primarily has a motor problem with it.
Or under-responsive. If you can't track where food is in your mouth, you can't manage it from an oral motor standpoint. Then you gag, then you lose foods in your mouth. Eating is uncomfortable. Yeah. If you're over-responsive, losing that little piece of food in your mouth might be really uncomfortable, or being able to even tolerate food from a touch and a visual standpoint to get it into your mouth might be really hard. So really all of the different sensory profiles contribute to equally challenging kind of eating problems.
That's a really good point. I think another issue that I've, especially since starting to work in the adult adolescent population, I'm starting to hear a lot more from eating disorder clinics and adults who've been diagnosed with eating disorders. And what I've learned from you guys is that there's a difference between eating disorders and feeding disorders.
Exactly. Yeah, so eating disorders are kind of a psychological based body image problem where, you know, how I look to myself, you know, in a mirror is not how my body actually looks, for example, or I choose not to eat as a way of kind of manipulating things, or because, you know, I'm punishing myself with it. Feeding disorders are a physical skill problem. It is not a body image problem. It's not a cognitive problem. It's not a behavior problem. It's a physical skill problem.
Yeah, there's one diagnosis that I know we've talked a lot back and forth on that I think I'm seeing a lot of the SPD overlap, and that's the diagnosis of ARFID.
Yeah, ARFID is kind of the new diagnosis in the feeding world, and unfortunately, ARFID is listed under the psychological diagnoses, and so it's taking something that in most of the kids who have an ARFID diagnosis now, they have a physical skill-based problem, but we're categorizing it under a psychological name, which is really tough because then it makes us miss the skill problem underneath.
So for those of you that don't know what ARFID is, it's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, right?
Correct.
Okay. So yeah, what you're saying is that it's kind of a catch-all for anybody that doesn't fit that typical eating disorder category of anorexia or bulimia, that it's been used more to be like, well, you're coming to us with this concern that your child isn't eating, or that you yourself struggle with eating, and this is where psychologists can put you.
Yeah, and it's, you know, and they will take a kid who's maybe 3 or 4 or 5 and then give them this psychological label as if they're not eating because they have anorexia. And it's not. It's because they have physical skill problems. And so it's really hard because it's leaving out the piece that's actually the problem. So we're missing how to fix it.
And I think one of the things that I really like that I've learned from working with feeding therapists is the whole is it like the iceberg?
Yeah.
Or whatever it is that you use to indicate, like, the feeding is the skill, but underneath that there's so much going on that you can't see because it's just the skill you're looking at.
Look at, you know, a lot of people, you know, have tons of kids and teenagers who are doing great at school, they're star students, they never get in trouble, everything's going for them, but they just won't eat. And so really feeding is kind of the tip of the iceberg, and that's kind of the canary in the coal mine of all of these problems that are underneath. So, you know, whether it's a sensory problem or a muscle problem, whether it's a tone or endurance problem, maybe an organ system problem, if they're having, you know, if their lungs aren't working great, breathing is our first priority. So you're not going to eat very well if you're sick or if you are having trouble breathing. We think about posture, we think about kind of the environment, we think about our learning history. There's so many pieces that can make eating really hard. And unfortunately, as kids get older, they tend to accumulate more and more of those negative learning experiences and things, which makes the process of getting better a little bit more tricky because there's more negative learning that we have to undo.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit more, because you kind of mentioned before that eating is a developmental skill, and a lot of times parents are told to just wait, he'll grow out of it, you know, when he's ready he'll start to eat this or do that. And for kids that do have these big under the iceberg problems, that just doesn't happen. It doesn't just go away. It doesn't just resolve on its own.
Yeah.
Can you talk about why that is?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of family, you know, even pediatricians will say, oh, you know, just take away his bottle, or, you know, he'll eat when he's hungry, those kinds of strategies. And there are some kids who that might work for, but those aren't the kids who have the physical skill-based problems. We know that there is a lot of picky eaters out there who aren't going to just get better if you just made them hungry because they don't have the skill. We like to give the example to parents of, if I told you, you know, you're going to, instead of, you know, flying on an airplane to go on vacation, you are going to be the pilot. I would bet a lot of money that you're going to forget your purse, and then you got in a car accident, and then you had to stop and get gas, and then you got a flat tire, and you're never going to make it to the airport because you don't have the skills to fly that airplane. And it's the same way with our kids. And so it can look like, oh, they're being manipulative, or they're being, you know, they're being bad, they just won't eat, they're non-compliant. But it's because they don't have the skill. And so that's a really hard kind of shift to help families make, because a lot of times people look at kids and adults who don't eat and say, oh, well, they're just choosing to be like that. They can do it if they wanted to. And really, it's a skill problem.
Yeah, I felt really fortunate lately to be working. I've actually been able to consult with some eating disorders clinics and talking to them about what is SPD, how could that affect an eating disorder program, and I think the more we can merge together the eating disorders and feeding disorders and kind of understand each other.
And teasing out which one is which.
Right.
Because it sounds like some of your clients that you've talked to have been labeled as having an eating disorder that maybe have a sensory-based physical cause to it.
Yeah, I really like those analogies that you guys use. I think it really helps parents, because I was just talking with a family earlier today about how difficult it is to understand what it would be like for these kids, for these teenagers, for these spouses, of seeing a huge pizza on the table, and why wouldn't you, how could you not like that pizza? How would you not
doesn't like pizza? Who doesn't like bacon?
And
who doesn't like ice cream?
Yeah, it's just such a difficult thing. If your nervous system is working properly, it's so difficult to make that leap into the textures just don't work for his body, and so it's going to cause a physiological reaction. And I think the more analogies and the more we can kind of help our parents or our spouses, siblings understand what even a piece of what it might be feeling like has been really helpful for some of the individuals I work with.
Yeah. So I'd really like if we could go into how you can tell, because everybody has a hard time feeding their children when they're young.
Sure.
So kind of going to that younger age group of how can you tell if this is a physical problem, like they physically are struggling to eat, or if it's just like that picky eating, like they're just not really into this food.
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually have a really awesome handout called the picky eaters and problem feeders. Yes, thank you. Yeah. There's a lot of handouts in my brain. So one of the big things that I think about is if you think about all of the foods that your kid will eat, all of them, like different flavors, all of that stuff, if it's less than 10 or so foods, you've got a problem feeder. Those are the kiddos who need therapy.
So even like babies? Or is that, like, is there a certain age?
Probably after about 2, I would say, for sure. But, a lot of our kids, their feeding problems, because it's a physical, skill-based problem, start when they're babies. They might not breastfeed very well. They might not be able to take a bottle very well. Eating might always be really hard for them. And then, transitioning between bottles and table foods, those transitions are always pretty tricky. And we see kids sometimes that go through a developmental shift, and so they eat okay until they're around 2 or 3 or 5 and 6, and then they kind of crash when their sensory systems take a hit, especially if they have some sensory issues, and then that's where we see feeding kind of the iceberg tip rise up, that now it becomes a big problem that we can recognize. So definitely if you're a parent questioning, is my kid a picky eater that might grow out of it, or a problem feeder that probably needs to get some help, I would definitely reroute you to our website and looking at that handout and having a conversation with your pediatrician about it. Multiple pediatrician visits. If you're reporting that your child is hard to feed and a picky eater, that's a big red flag to us. If it's once in a while, there are hard days, that kind of stuff is more potentially in the field of what's normal. But also we can do a lot to help make family meals easier, to help explain some of those pieces to families and help make meal times not be such a hard time of the day.
Yeah, I'm going to take a little sidestep to talk about personally, because I do have, she's 4 now, but she was definitely had a lot of problems as a child, as a very young child, like breastfeeding and taking bottles and transitioning to purees and solids and all that. Like, she really had a lot of struggles. And I was very fortunate to learn some strategies to do with her. And she's doing fantastic. She's doing really, really well. I don't know if she ever would have been a quote-unquote problem eater, because she was definitely eating. But even thinking about, there are things that you can do to learn about food. And so we've talked about, like, I didn't have to bring her to food school, but by learning some of those things to just, it's okay to play with food. It's okay to learn about food. And if you don't want to eat it, that's okay, but it's still going to be here, and we're going to figure out what you can handle with it.
And all of that learning and playing with food and getting messy and painting your face with different purees and things, that's teaching us what the food's going to be like in our mouth. It's not just playing with food to waste it. When we're, smearing it around on the table, we're figuring out what it's going to feel like. When we use a food chopper and chop up crackers versus grapes, we figure out that crackers are going to make powder in our mouth and spread all over the place versus a grape that's going to squish and make juice. We can figure out all of those properties, so when it gets into our mouth someday, it's not a surprise.
Yeah, I love, when I started learning about what you guys do, I love the fact that the end goal of a session is not necessarily that a kid will eat anything.
Yeah.
And I think that's such an important message for so many of us thinking about feeding and eating, that you guys talk about the steps to eating. Mm-hmm. And I love that, because you guys have a handout that you can show to parents and say, if they moved up from just being able to look at it to touching it with one finger, that is progress in our sensory systems. And that is the kid making gains in their feeding. And I love that kind of transitioning our thoughts about feeding therapy.
Yeah, and our goal in sessions is to have a positive experience around food. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that looks like being in the room and watching me do something with the food and the child can handle it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that looks like us cooking and making a treat for, to take home to dad. Sometimes we're, doing experiments and we're combining new foods in different ways and figuring out how to fix it and being food scientists. It looks like a lot of different things, but I have fun in my job every single day, because learning about food can be fun, and figuring out how to make it fun and exciting is really rewarding and awesome.
I have one more question for you. So one of the things you talked about earlier was how that iceberg can kind of start to emerge, and the feeding skill is the thing that's at the top of that.
Yeah.
I think that it's common around here is that they'll come with feeding concerns, but then you'll also identify, well, yes, there's some problems with feeding, but then tell me about, like, what are some of the other things that are very common that you see are also an issue?
Yeah, so a lot of times when we see kids coming in for feeding problems, or even adults, there's generally some tactile issues. So whether it's being tactily over-responsive and clothing is uncomfortable, or, the grooming activities, those kinds of things, I most of the time end up finding kind of body awareness praxis problems in people who are having a hard time learning to eat, because there's so much body awareness and motor planning involved with tracking the food in your mouth and all of those oral motor skills and managing the foods, that I would say probably the tactile and the praxis body awareness pieces are the biggest things. The other thing that I see a lot, though, is that people start to get over-reliant on their eyes, and that their eyes start to be kind of the boss of their body, and that people get really quick to look at a food and say, oh, that's a food I don't eat, or yes, that's my perfect food, I can eat it. And then there's kind of no in-between. And so what we work on in therapy is kind of helping find that gray zone, that middle area of what else can we do? How can we fix it for your eyes? Those kinds of things. So I think, people have a tendency to look at stuff and make a quick judgment about it without necessarily going that next step to explore it.
So, okay, follow-up question to that one is it always just about the food and working with the food, or are there other things that you need to work on in that iceberg to make those changes in how you're living?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're eating something that your body's not tolerating, whether it's an allergy or a sensitivity or an intolerance, if you don't feel good when you eat, you're not going to want to keep eating. Babies who have a lot of reflux learn that eating hurts, and so they're not going to keep eating. Thinking about the environment, if meals are a really stressful time of the day because, getting everybody hurry up to the table, hurry up and eat, and we have to go to soccer practice and this and that, that kind of family environment sometimes can be something that we work on, and figuring out how to set aside time so that it's not so stressful, and what do we talk about at meals to make it a little bit more fun and enjoyable. So there's definitely a lot of other pieces that aren't just food related, because in our culture food is love, food is relationships, food is social outings, food's everywhere. And so figuring out how to make the food not be such a problem can really help open up, opportunities for kids to go to camps and opportunities for sleepovers and, all of those, going to college, leaving the house, making your own meals. All of those things are huge life transitions, and eating's a part of all of it. And so we definitely work on kind of the whole person relationships with food.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I love the multidisciplinary team you guys have. You guys have a doctor, a nutritionist, OT, speech, family services.
Speech therapists.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love looking at it from all those aspects that you guys do, and I love the points that you're making. I think it really hits home for a lot of the kids and adults that I see.
So thank you guys for watching. We hope this answers a lot of your questions. I know we've gotten several questions about feeding. So I know it's brief, I know it's an overview, but hopefully it's clarified some stuff. One thing that I want to make sure you guys remember is that we do have a symposium coming up in October. There's going to be tons of information about sensory processing disorder. I'm really excited to be presenting at the parent workshop the day before the actual official symposium, so I really hope to see some of you there, answer some of your questions in person, and really help support you as you continue to learn about sensory processing disorder.
Yeah, thanks guys.